Now we're on Peizayin Amid Beis. Machuk Shabo, then there was another measuring of an Isaron that was flat. Hoimoded l'chavite kohen gadol. And that one was used to measure the flour for the daily minchas chavitim of the kohen gadol. And this is all the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Now, since the chavitim of the kohen gadol, of the mincha of the kohen gadol, has to be half of an isaron of flour, but you have to start with a full isaron and then divide it up into two halves. So the initial isaron of flour was used with a machuk, a leveled isaron measure, even though flour for other menachos were measured with a gadush, but not the case of the kohen gadol. Of the chavita, the minchas chavita and kohen gadol, and Rashi points out that Rabbi Meir's opinion is based on a tradition that he had. That there are two types of Isaron measurements in the Beis HaMikdash. One was heaped and the other was leveled. Now, why does Rabbi Meir assume that the leveled Isaron was used for the chavitim and the heaped Isaron for other menachos? The flour of the chavitim mincha had to be divided. And if a heaped measure were used, some flour would likely spill on the ground while it was being divided. It was therefore more reasonable that the leveled isaron measure should be used for the flour of this mincha, so it shouldn't spill over. Chachamim omrim lo hayisham ela isaron echad. There were not two measuring utensils for the saron. There was only one. Shenemar, as the pasuk says clearly in Bamidbar Perikov test that we mentioned earlier, Visaron echad and lekeves echad. So okay, matalim over isaron, right? Right? We saw that Rabbi Meir derived his conclusion from the double language isaron, that there were two different measurements. L'rabos chatzi isaron. Right? If you go back to the beginning of our Mishnah on Peizayin Amid Aleph, it says Shtei midos shel yovesh hay b'mikdash isaron v'chatzi isaron. So the Gemara now turns it the other way around and says Rabbi Meir Chatzi Isaron Minole, right? He uses the double language Isaron Isaron not to include Chatzi Isaron, but that there were two types of measurements of the Isaron. So how does he derive the conclusion that there was another measurement called the Chatzi Isaron? And the Gemara answers Nafkale mi vi Isaron, right? From the extra vav. So Rabbanon, vav lo darshi, they don't darsh in the vav. Rabbi Meir, hi isaron echad lakeves echad mai avid le. Right, Chachamim derived from the word echad that there's only one isaron, and yet Rabbi Meir holds there were two isronos, right, the heaped and the flat. So what's he going to do with the echad? Hu shelo yimdod lo b'shel shlosh lepar v'lo shel shnayim li'ayil. Right, that he does it in increments of one isaron, but rather there's no special measuring utensil for shnei isronos in the case of the aisle, or shlosh isronos in the case of a par. For Rabbanon, right, they use the word echad to teach you that there was only one isaron. How do they know that you would not um, have to get a larger isaron for the par or for the ayil. Nafkalo mini kudo. So there's a tradition that certain letters in the Torah have a dot on top of it, and the word isaron in the Sefer Torah, according to our tradition, has a dot on top of it. The Sanyas we learned in the Brisa, Amar Rab Yossi, Lama Nakud Vav Shebe Emtzi Isaron. Right, so there's a vav in the word isaron. On top of the vav, there's a dot. And what do we derive from that dot? And the answer is shel isaron rishon shel yontif, rishon shel chag. So chag here is a reference to Sukkot, and the first isaron mentioned with regard to the karbanos was the isaron of Sukkot. Isaron lakeves echad. So there's a dot upon the vav in the word v'isar, the second vav. And what's the function of this dot? Shelo yimdod lo b'shel shlosh lepar v'shlo shel shnayim li'ayel. So it's a kind of a mute, a restriction, or a limitation. And according to the Rabbana, we derive from the dot over the term Isaron that the measures in the temple were all restricted to the size of Isaron. There was none for that was 2 Isronos or 3 Isronos. Rabbi Meir, what does he do with the dot? Nokud lo darsh. She doesn't derive any conclusions from the extra dot. Then the Mishnah says, Chatzi Isaron mehoy mishame sheboy moded lechavite kohen gadol. So the Gemara asks, Moded, are you telling me that you measured half isaron of flour for the morning chavite kohen gadol, and then you measured out another half of it isaron for the afternoon chavitim kohen gadol? No, Ramina, we know from a Mishnah that chavite kohen gadol lo hayaboyin chatzonel maybe isaron shalom v'chotzeu. You bring an entire isaron and then you split it in half. Rav Sheshes, my moded nami diktoni. What does the word moded mean in our Mishnah? It means machalik, meaning first he was moded a full isaron and then he would divide it into 2 halves. Boy minei Rami bar Chami Rav Chisda. Chatzi isaron l'Rabbi Meir gadish haya o machak haya. Right, so the Rabbanon did not have this. Just 1 second. Did not have the third category of a measuring receptacle for the flour, namely chatzi saron, but Rabbi Meir had it. Now, the Gemara vacillates as to what was the nature of that chatzi isaron measuring utensil of Rabbi Meir. Was it gadush, heaped, or was it machuk? It was flat, it was leveled. He writes here, was it a small vessel that measured a half isaron only when the flour was heaped over the top, or was the vessel large enough to hold a complete half isaron of flour in its interior, even when leveled? So the suffix here, the Gemara, is what was the size of this utensil called a chatzi isaron according to Rabbi Meir? Okay, fine. We have a mnemonic device here. So Gemara asks the following. I mean, Rab Chisda was wondering, why do you ask me, Rabbi, by uh, according to Rabbi Meir? Why don't you ask me even according to Rabbanon? You should ask me. Just 1 second. I'm not sure of this translation here. But let's go on a little bit because I'm not clear about this translation that I have in front of me. Anyway, the Rabbanah, the Gemara says, Isarn gufe kami boile. Right. You could ask according to Rabbanan about the Isaron. Gadushayu machakayu. The suffix of Rami Bar Chama was about the Chatzi Isaron. And that's only relevant to Rabbi Meir. The Rabbanan stated that there's only one type of Isaron measure that was used. They did not specify whether it was heaped or leveled. So with respect to Rabbanan, you could ask, okay, I was doing okay, but now became a little complicated for me. Just a second. Ah, oh, so let's go back to the Mishnah one more time on the bottom of Pei Zayin and Aleph. According to Rabbanan, there were only shtei midos for measuring flour. There was the saron and there was a chatzi saron. And the chatzi saron was used for measuring the chavite kohen gadol. According to Rabbi Meir, not only was there an isaron and a chatzi saron, but there were two measurings of isaron, two vessels, two isaron vessels. Right? And that was dependent on how you interpret the pasuk, isaron, isara. So now the Gemara is saying the following. You're asking Rami Bar Chama, the Chatzi Saron was a Godesh of Machuk, but you're only asking according to Rabbi Meir. Why didn't you ask even according to Chachamim? So the Gemara says that Rami Bar Chama explains why he asked only according to Rabbi Meir. Le Rabbanon, according to the Rabbanon, Isaron Gufa Kami Boila. We don't even know whether the Saron was Godesh or Machuk. And I was only asking about the Chatzi Saron, and therefore I would only ask according to Rabbi Meir. Why is that? Just one second, I'm missing that last point here. With respect to Rabbi Meir's opinion, there's no question requiring the Isaron itself. Rabbi Meir clearly states there were two Isarons. There was one that was heaped, one that was level. But in the case of the Chatzi Saron, Rabbi Meir didn't tell us whether it was heaped or it was leveled. That was the suffix of Rami Bar Chama. So Rami Bar Chama could have still asked this question even according to the Rabbanon. Because the Rabbanon also have a Chatzi Saron. What was it? So again, I'm not sure why Rami Bar Chama decided to ask his question only with regard to, in other words, according to the Rabbanan, we'll have to ask two questions. We're going to have to ask what was the nature of the Saron and what was the nature of the Chatzi Saron. Because the Rabbanan don't tell us what was the nature of the Saron. According to Rami Bar Chama, we know that there were two categories of Isaron. One was heaped and one was leveled. The only suffix we have is what about the Chatzi Isaron according to Rabbi Meir? Amalei, so now Rav Chizda resolves the question of Rami Bar Chama. Mida Rabbi Meir nishma Rabbi Meir, mida Rabbi Meir nishma Rabbanan. What does that mean? Mida Rabbi Meir isaron machuk. since Rabbi Meir had two categories of Isaron, one of which was Machuk, right? It was leveled. Therefore, we want to derive the conclusion by analogy that the Chatz Isar was also Machuk. So if you measure the Chavitim flour using a leveled Isaron measure, which is called Machuk, then it makes sense to assume that Rabbi Meir holds that with regard to the Minchas Chavitim, as opposed to the other Menachos, they were all measured with Machuk, and therefore even the Chatzi Saron, which after they divided the Chavitim, was also Machuk. And Mida Rabbi Meir Machuk, Rabbanan Nami Machuk. The Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Meir only with regard to the number of Isarim, but not with regard to the type of Isarim measure that they used. So they agree that the Isarim measure used for the Minchas Chavitim, which was used for all Menachos, was Machuk, so as to prevent spillage while the flour is being divided. Okay. Boy, Vinei Rami Bar Chami Rav Chizda, Kavite Kohen Gadol, Bameh Mechalkon Lechalos, Biyad O Bekli. Right, the Chavite Kohen Gadol were accompanied with 12 chalos. And this we derive from Gzeir Shav to Lechem Aponim. So they offered 6 chalos in the morning and 6 in the afternoon. Rabbi Chama wants to know, how is the dough for each of these 6 chavitin divided? Was it divided by hand or with a kli? Must one use a measuring utensil to ensure that the 12 chavitim loaves will be exactly the same size? Or you could do it by ma'uma, divide it by hand, and that would be enough, even though it might not ensure the exactly the same size. Now, other menachos are divided into 10 loaves, and the 10 loaves of a regular mincha do not have to be equal in size, and therefore, obviously, they would be divided by hand. With regard to the chavitin mincha of the Kohen Gadol, its 12 loaves must be exactly equal to one another in measure. Rabbi Chama therefore inquires whether one must use a measuring utensil to precisely divide the dough of the chavitim. And yet Rav Chizda, to our surprise, says pshita de biyad. And why is that so? Because if you would have to bring in a kli, a utensil, which is called a turtane, in order to divide and weigh each of the lechamim to make sure that they're all equal exactly. Yachnis, would we bring such a scale into the Azara? So Gemara says, "V'yachnis, what's so terrible with bringing a scale into the?" And the Gemara answers that for this you really have to know the parsha of the Tochacha in Vayikra Vav, and the punishments for deviating from God's will. It says, "Veishivu lachmachem b'mishkal." Bring back your bread by weight. The loaves would crumble in the oven, forcing them to use a scale to divide the remaining crumbs. So to bring a scale into the Azara, since it's associated with this klola, is therefore lav orach abba, it's not proper. Boy, Minei Rami Bar Chavi Rav Chizda Shulchan Maushi Kaddish Kmotzim Begodishlo. Normally, the kiddush of the komets is achieved through a kli. Okay, so Rashi's learning here that we're not talking about the kmitza per se, but rather be talking about the levona. So you need two komets measures of levona. Oh, so when I said before that normally the kiddush of the levona was done in a kli, I'm referring to the bazichin. Can the shulchan itself substitute for the bazichin? Now we know that the shulchan is makadesh the lechem aponim. That's where the lechem aponim are designated to go. What about the levona, which normally would undergo a process of kiddush through the bazichin? If let's say instead of putting the levona into bazichin, he put it on the shulchan. Mean makadesh lechem kmotzim nami makadesh. We say that to the same extent that the shulchan is makadesh lechem aponim, it's also makadesh the bazichin, meaning the levona without the bezichin. O dilmano, the chazile mekadesh, right? That which goes on the shulchan, namely the lechem aponim, that it's mekadesh. Lo chazile, lo mekadesh. The levona is supposed to be placed in bezichin, not on the shulchan, and therefore maybe the shulchan would not be mekadesh the levona. Omole ena mekadesh. What do you mean, Eini? Is that so? V'homer Rabbi Yochanan, l'divrei omer tfachayim umechza kofel, nimtza shulchan mekadesh chamisha asar tefach lamala. L'divrei omer tfachayim kofel is nimtza shulchan mekadesh shneim asar tefach lamala. Right, the width of the shulchan was 6 tfachim. And the width of the lechamim was 12 tfachim. Just make sure if I got that right. So an amma is 5 tfachim. The total length of each lechem was 10 tfachim. I said 12, I think. 10 tfachim. Now, the table, the shulchan, was only 1 amma, which is 5 tfachim. So therefore, you have an extra 5 tfachim. You're going to have to bend over the ends of the lechem, 2.5 tfachim on each side, equal 5 tfachim, so that the lechem in its complete form of 5 tfachim, now that you bent over 2.5 and 2.5, would fit the exact width of the shulchan, which was 5 tfachim. Okay, let me just see. Yeah. So we have two opinions, and the question is, how far from the bottom of the shulchan was it till the top of the 6th highest lechem? Was it 15 or 12? 15 tefachim or 12 tefachim? In any event, we see that the Shulchan was Makadish anything that's placed on it. And therefore, it could be Makadish even the Levona. Amalei, so Muhammad says, Ain't Makadish li Karev. It's not Makadish the Levona, so that now we could be makdir on the Mizbeach, Makadish li Posel. It only is Makadish it to the extent that now if it goes outside the Azar, it's Posel Mishum Yotzei. Or Mishum Negia B'Tful Yom. And that leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Pei Zayin Amid Beis. Sheva Midos Shalach Hoy B'Migdash. Right, whereas in the case of Yovesh, we only had two, or according to Abmeir, three categories. Here we have 7 categories. We'll see later on that that's Halacha Moshe Misinai, that there had to be 7 for measuring liquids. And what were those 7? Hin, Chatzi Hin, Shlishis Hahin, Revius Hahin. Log, Chatzi Log, Revius Log. All told 7. Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Tzadok Omer, Shnasos Hoy Behin. There was only one measurement, and that was a hin. And they would make markings on the side of the hin. Adkan for the par, right? The minchas sochem that would accompany the par. V'adkan li ayil, adkan li keves. But all in told, there was only one measuring utensil. Rabbi Shimon Omer lohoy shom hin. There was no hin in the Beis Hamikdash. The chimehoya hin mishamish. Right, the only time hin was functional was only when Moshe Rabbeinu measured a hin's worth of shemen zayis for the purpose of the shemen hamishcha. Other than that, a hin measure would serve no purpose, for the anointing oil miraculously remained intact throughout the generations. So they didn't have to create shemen hamishcha once again. Therefore, says Reb Shimon, there was no measuring of a hin. Elamidi yiser shalog umechza hoysasha. Meaning that if Rabbi Shimon removes the hin, then apparently he would substitute something for the hin, and that was an additional measuring vessel for a log and a half. Sheboya moded leminchas kohen gadol. Logu mechza baboker, the logu mechza bein harbayim. Right, so we spoke about the flour, which was dry, and that was a chatzi saron. But now we're talking about the oil, and the oil is liquid, and you needed, all told, 3 logim of shemen. A log and a half in the morning and a log and a half in the afternoon. So Reb Shimon is going to add another measuring for liquids of a log and a half for the purpose of the minchas chafitin of the Kohen Gadol, which required 3 lugim of oil for 1 isarn of solus. Tanur Rabbanan, we learned to the Brisa, Sheva Midos Shalachai v'Migdash Revius. Oh. So now the Brisa is going to record a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir as to what direction we go. We start with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda starts with the lower measuring, the smaller measuring, it goes up to the larger measuring. Starts with Revius log, goes up to Chatzi log, and then up to a log. Same thing in Hin. Starts with the lower Revius Hin, up to Shlishas Hin, and then all the way up to Chatzi Hin. From the lower or smaller to the higher and the larger. Rabbi Meir does it the other way around. Hin, and then Chatzi Hin, Ushlisha Hin, Revius Hin goes in a downward from the larger to the smaller. Log, Chatzi log, Revius log. Reb Shimon Omer Lahoy him. Ki mahoya hin mishamis. Like we said before, there was no purpose in the Mikdash to the hin.